far you have come on your own, but never alone. Through the rain and through the shine, here's your moment, it's your time. You stood tall and now you see, standing in your destiny. 100 women growing strong. 100 women where you belong. You stood tall and now you see, you have reached your destiny. Woman, woman.
As people of African descent, we offer this land recognition in solidarity with the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the efforts and deliberate intentions toward decolonization. As people of African descent, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, express deep gratitude to its indigenous peoples, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us all. By Kay Johnson. Welcome to 100 ABC Fireside Chats. 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Women is a bold project initiated by co-authors and co-founders, the Honorable Dr. Jean Augustine, Dr. Denise O'Neill Green, and Donna Jones Simmons. Our mission is to celebrate and archive the professional accomplishments of trailblazing Black women from all across Canada. The goal is to create an ever-expanding database available for current and future generations via print media, public and private libraries, as well as our website, which is www.100abcwomen.ca. In addition to our fireside chats on topics that matter to our communities, such as education, healthcare, entertainment, creative arts, trade union, and so much more, we offer biennial book launching galas and biannual symposiums. The co-authors and co-founders would like to take this opportunity to thank each of you for attending today's fireside chat. We know that you will find these sessions educational and inspirational. So sit back, relax, and hear from our brilliant and talented honorees.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Marie Clark Walker, a 2018 100 ABC recipient and your moderator for today, where we will be discussing ILO Convention 190. The ILO is the International Labor Organization. It is the United Nations agency whose mandate is to advance social and economic justice by setting labor standards for all member states to ratify, implement, and follow. It is the only tripartite agency within the UN system, which means that all standards, conventions, and recommendations are negotiated, backed, and supported by committees comprised of governments, employers, and workers. Each committee has spokespersons representing all three groups. Conventions, standards are negotiated, adopted, and then ratified by each member state. Once a country ratifies the convention, it comes into force in the country, usually a year following ratification. Convention 190, what is it? It is the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. And I had the privilege of being the worker spokesperson for this innovative and groundbreaking convention, aided by an amazing secretariat and team of workers from around the world. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by two other 100 ABC Women awardees who will be discussing violence and harassment in the world of work, sharing experiences and strategies with you and with each other over the next hour. Let me also say Happy Canada Day to all those watching. I hope that you are enjoying the amazing weather out there. And to those who are watching from the Caribbean, we are thinking of you, and you are all in our thoughts and prayers, and hoping that Hurricane Beryl does not do any major damage. So let's get on with it. On the panel today, we have Lavinia Latham. Lavinia is a human rights lawyer who has successfully represented clients at all levels in the criminal justice system, including at the Supreme Court of Canada, the Canadian Human Rights and Ontario Human Rights Tribunals. She also co-developed and launched an anti-racism leadership course for Catholic Principles, for the Catholic Principles Council, and has led over 100 equity and human rights training sessions. Welcome. We're also joined today by Canada's safety diva, Leanne Lyon-Bartley, lovingly known as Canada's safety diva. Leanne is the Executive Vice President at Dexterra Group, responsible for health, safety, sustainability, quality, and community. With over 20 years in the field, she's extremely passionate about creating safe, healthy, and sustainable workplaces for all. Welcome to you both. Well, Convention 190, what is it? It is the first international standard that aims to put an end to violence and harassment in the world of work, recognizing a future of work that is based on dignity and respect. Convention 190 is a visionary convention that also recognizes that gender-based violence and harassment is systemic and based on unequal and abusive power relations in the world of work, as well as intersecting systems of oppression. One would think that between the Me Too movement and George Floyd's murder, that things would have changed in terms of violence, of the rate of violence and harassment in the world of work. However, that's not what we're currently seeing. The rate at which Black women are falling off the glass cliff is a symptom of the pervasive nature of racism in the world of work, which is a form of violence and harassment. I want to talk about the prevalence as well as what we can do to make the necessary changes. Canada ratified the convention in January 2023, and it came into force in January of this year, meaning it is law, and Canada has had to put the necessary laws and policy measures to prevent and address issues of violence and harassment in the world of work. So let's begin. Leanne, I'm going to begin with you. What does C-190 look like at the federal and provincial levels? And do you think it's being enforced?
Yeah, thanks, Marie. So, you know what, I want to give a little bit of backstory as well, because we've been talking about violence and harassment in the workplace long before actually the ILO convention came into play. I think the province of Ontario was one of the first to legislate violence and harassment protections under occupational health and safety way back in 2010. Now, of course, they put it in place, but not much had changed or moved, as you've already said. And I think really with this C-190, it really does give a little bit more teeth. And now all of the provinces in Canada have had to put legislation in place where that wasn't the case before this. Right. So from a federal level, there's lots of protections in place for federal employees that are working in federally regulated workplaces. But as well, it did mandate that all the provinces have to make sure they put legislation in place as well. So that means the rest of us that don't work in federally regulated workplaces have protections against violence and harassment where they didn't exist right across the country. So what does that really mean and what does that look like? It really means that employers have to make sure they have policies, make sure they have procedures and programs and protections for employees. When employees do report something, they actually have to act. And I know Lavinia will talk a little bit more about what does that really look like. And then, it changes the conversation too, right? Because now we actually have to address and identify where are these likely occurrences of violence and harassment in our workplaces. And then when we've identified them, what controls will we put in place? So that's a little bit, just in a nutshell. And I know we'll talk a little bit further.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you. They were saying that we can't see now I can see you. So when we were negotiating, we wanted to ensure that Convention 190 applied to all workers, and therefore there is a very broad definition of workers. The convention applies to every sector and all workers in both the informal and formal economy. Protection is extended to full, part-time, casual workers. They are job seekers, job applicants, apprentices, interns, trainees, including workers whose employment has been terminated. It also recognizes that individuals who exercise authority, duties, or responsibilities of an employer can also be subjected to violence and harassment. So there is broad coverage. Lavinia, you see and hear these complaints every single day. What are the most common forms of workplace harassment that workers face, and who is making these complaints?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I do see quite a few variants of workplace harassment, discrimination. What I will say I see the most is racial discrimination, racial harassment. And as much as we live in a society and, I live in the GTA, it's quite diverse. There are quite a few different racialized members. I would argue that GTA is looking a lot more brown and Black than it is looking white. But nevertheless, we see those complaints coming from the Black community. And so it really does show that anti-Black racism is strong, it's alive. And those who are the closest on the continuum to being Afrocentric from Africa as a descendant is experiencing the racism in numbers that are larger above and beyond those of other racialized groups. Now, the second area that I would say I see a lot of workplace harassment complaints in would have to be sexual harassment. So I do see a lot of gender-based discrimination, gender-based harassment, women coming into the workplace for the purposes of this conversation, those who identify as women are, experiencing, I would say, forms of sexual harassment. So, inappropriate touching, inappropriate commentary, being passed up for various different promotions, those kinds of things. Another thing that's growing, and I'm starting to see a lot of, and we are doing work within this area to not only, conduct investigations in this area, but also educate the public, is bullying. And the term in 2024 is mobbing. So that's essentially where, a group of individuals decide that, hey, we're going to team up on this one person and create a toxic environment for them, basically exclusion, kind of like schoolyard politics. We're going to make sure that this person feels very uncomfortable being in the workplace in hopes of basically shutting them out. So that's kind of the stuff that I see rolling across my desk as it relates to investigations and workplace harassment.
Thank you, Lavinia. Leanne, would you like to add to this? I know that intersectionality was key when we were doing the negotiations, because interestingly enough, there were a lot of people that did not understand what intersectionality was. So we had to do a whole primer on intersectionality when we were negotiating.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Lavinia said and talk a little bit about some of the violence incidents that we actually see in my company. We're a lot of front-facing where we're dealing with the public and others. We've had employees that have been in situations of, like, we have employees who work in malls, for example, and we've been in situations where violent incidents have happened in the malls, but it's our employees that actually come across it and witness it and see it, and then are affected by that. So we've seen where, mental health comes into play, where people are dealing with the trauma from some of these incidents. Of course, there's worker to worker violence, but as well, we see sexual violence. We have, employees that are working in remote workplaces and camps and things like that. And we've seen incidents as well where, they're getting not only harassed, but also assaulted. And so, it's real, right? Like, and that's the thing. And I think that's part of what this whole issue brings to light, is that these things are happening to workers, and what is the effect to these workers and their coworkers when these incidents do happen. And so it's really great to see that we've changed the conversation, because this is a real life thing that's been going on and been going on for a very long time.
Yeah, we've seen, again, post-COVID, the incidents of extreme violence with education workers, with Toronto transit workers and other transit workers, things that, people they sort of just pushed aside before, but now they're being taken very, very seriously because they're happening in very, very large numbers. One of the other things, again, I'm going to encourage people to read this convention. It's not a difficult read. It's in very, very clear language and easy to understand, is third-party violence. And when we were negotiating, it's interesting because when we were negotiating third party, the workers group only wanted third party as perpetrators. And it was the Africa group that said, hold up a second, we need to look at third party as also victims. And that same week we were negotiating was when the Raptors won. And Masai Ujiri was in the stadium in Brooklyn, and was stopped violently, I might add, to be told that he couldn't join the rest of his team. Why was he stopped? Well, he was a Black man, and they didn't think a Black man, would be a general manager or have a high level position. And so we used that story actually to get that in the convention and to get them to agree that third party can be both perpetrator and victim. So, a lot of the things that were happening at the time really also pushed us into getting language into the convention. And I'll talk about domestic violence afterwards, because Leanne, you just mentioned, the whole who gets affected. Again, this is the first convention where domestic violence is included as a form of violence and harassment in the world of work. People who are dealing with that when they come to work, they're around their coworkers, and they have to make sure that it is still the employer's responsibility to make sure their coworkers are protected and they are protected as well. So there were things, policies and procedures that needed to be put into place in terms of, phone calls, in terms of emails, in terms of who was coming into the actual workspace, and all of those things. So let me just digress. I digress from it. Let me get back on topic. I want to note that the term world of work was purposeful. In the negotiations, we agreed that the workplace was more than just the surrounding four walls where one worked. And then we had the onset of COVID. It was easier to envision that there was no argument that the workplace after that could be anywhere, right? The convention expands the world of work to cover workplaces, including public and private spaces where there are a place of work, places where a worker is paid, takes a rest, takes a break, has a meal, uses sanitary or washing, changing facilities. It includes work-related trips, travel, training events, or social activities, through work-related communications, inclusive of those enabled by information and communication technology, and also in employer-provided accommodations and when folks are commuting to and from work. So the convention covers all of those spaces. So Lavinia, we know that oftentimes employees feel that their complaints are not being dealt with. So how should employers respond if an employee reports incidents of violence and harassment in the world of work?
Yeah, so this is another great question. I feel that employers they have an obligation to ensure that they are maintaining a safe and secure workplace environment for their employees. And so when a complaint comes in that's not actually the case, it then becomes the employer's duty to investigate, the employer's duty to respond. And so a proper response would be, number one, taking the complaint. That could be either a formal complaint or informal. The difference really being is this going to be a written complaint? Is it going to be documented somewhere and maintained securely in a specific area? The next piece that I would recommend employers do is to conduct an investigation. Now, that's a decision that's not to be taken lightly as it relates to who is going to conduct that investigation. So if the employer is large enough where they can maintain that independence, they can maintain being an unbiased party to all those involved within the complaint, then sure, go ahead. But if you are a small employer environment, if you do require, some level of arm's length, of a relationship to the parties involved, then I would strongly recommend that you engage an external workplace investigator who can have that independence, who can have that unbiased approach. And so I really feel like it is actually preferable that an employer reaches out to an external agency. That's the work that I do. I am a lawyer, I'm an investigator. It doesn't necessarily have to be me, but somebody who can, approach it and understand what procedural fairness is, understand what the Occupational Health and Safety Act is, and the, Ontario Human Rights Code, the Canada Human Rights Act, if we are working within the federal sphere, those things. So it's really important that unbiased nature, that independence piece is truly maintained, because if it's not there, then those findings mean nothing.
Thank you, Lavinia. And we know that if you are in a unionized environment, the union can take on some of those investigative roles. But if you're not, it's a little bit more difficult. And yes, it is the employer's responsibility, but we also have scenarios where we have informal workers that don't have any kind of organizational backing. And what we would recommend to those, I don't know if you would agree, but one of my recommendations would be to call the legal clinics who could provide some assistance free of charge or for a nominal fee, because as we know, hiring lawyers and external investigators can get pretty expensive, and the employer tends to have the upper hand, right? And so the worker is left with very little recourse in their mind. So we need to make sure that we do the training that is necessary for legal clinics to also provide those types of supports to informal workers who are not represented by any organization or any group outside. Yes, Leanne.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that because, and I'm not sure, so don't quote me, but there's also in most provinces what they call the Office of the Worker Advisor, right? And I think they can also help because violence and harassment is covered under pretty much all provincial health and safety legislation as well. So that's also another free resource for workers that are non-unionized that I think can provide some support.
So
thank you, Leanne. Lavinia.
Yeah, one thing that I might add, so I think it's a little bit of a misconception, and perhaps there are circumstances where an employer might hire external investigator and kind of drive the results, the findings in the direction that they want. I can't say that that never happens, but I can say that that's highly inequitable. That's it's not correct, right? And it definitely flies in the face of procedural fairness. So as it relates to hiring, say for example, a lawyer who does investigations as well to do something like that, we cannot be workplace investigator and lawyer in the same matter, right? So as it relates to the lawyer responsibility to their clients to advocate for their interests as if they were their own, that relationship doesn't exist as it relates to investigators. So oftentimes I can speak to my own investigations. I will recommend that certain actions are taken to ensure procedural fairness. And I would say 9.99999 times out of 10, the employer is, they're agreeing with that. They're agreeable to that. So as it relates to, I've never really seen it in my practice where an employer is like, yeah, I see you're investigating this, but let's, shift this way. I'm paying for it and I want this person to come out on top. I want their interest to be served because it matches my interest. I've never seen that. And if I did see that, I could say that wouldn't be a file that I would be comfortable continuing with, because ultimately, it's your ethics, it's your values, it's your morals. And if you don't have that, then what do you have, right? But as it relates to cheaper options, you can, like, I think employers can absolutely hire internal advisors, internal human rights and equity people, DEI, that stands for diversity, equity, inclusion for those who are watching, someone who has that knowledge base and who understands how to balance the interests of competing parties. I think that having that person conduct an investigation would be your next best step.
I also think it's important that both parties agree on the investigator. And while you haven't seen incidents where there is bias, I've seen it. I actually, over the last couple of years, more so than I've seen it in the last 30. So, I think that it's really important for both parties to be involved in who is chosen to do the investigation.
I agree with you
So,
completely. It makes a huge difference when everyone's comfortable,
yeah,
100%.
exactly. So Leanne, how can these incidents of violence and harassment, including, third party, be prevented?
First and foremost, employers are supposed to do a risk assessment of the work and of the workplace, right? To identify where are the likelihood of the violence and harassment to occur. And then once you've done that, you can, start to work through, well, how do I maybe mitigate that? But even before the risk assessment, I think one of the critical things, it's about the culture in a workplace, right? Like, can we build a culture in a workplace where people are civil and respectful to one another, first and foremost? And what does that actually mean? So some of the information that's out there will say, like, listen, actually define what civility and respect looks like in our workplace, right? So we're going to talk to one another respectfully. What if we have disagreements, we're not going to start yelling and raising our voices. We're going to say hello, like, don't leave people out, and smile with one another. So, like, define, right? And then as well, a key piece to the culture is a reporting culture. So allow employees to feel that it's okay to bring up their concerns, their issues, their safety concerns, and how we respond to that as the employers and managers and supervisors lets employees know that this is a safe place, right, to be able to bring forward your issues. Because I think first and foremost, when you have that type of culture, it can eliminate a lot of things from going wrong, right? And then as well, if there are issues, it can help us to just deal with them sooner before it becomes a bigger issue later. So those are a couple of the key things that I would say from a prevention standpoint. But, you're going to want to think about, how secure can I make my workplace for my employees, especially if they're dealing with third party, right? And how do I maybe, deal with that as well? If something happens, what is my emergency response? And make sure everybody knows, and there's training involved, and people know what to do if there is an issue, especially for third party. We just did a tabletop where we did a bit of an exercise. It was just with our office even, but it was, what happens if an active attacker comes? How do we deal with that? We had good conversation. We got our joint health and safety committee members involved as well. And even just being prepared for even something that is so unlikely in our office. But what do we do, right? And making sure people just have that opportunity to practice can also help prevent further loss and harm if something were to happen. So there's quite a lot of tips and tools that people can do to help prevent things. I'm going to put probably in the chat, there's even some really simple infographics that give some really good bullet points for workers, for employees, for employers on what to do. And I will put that in the chat.
Thank you, Leanne. We also know that, for workers to have supports, it's extremely important. And when the policies and procedures, et cetera, have been changed, to make sure that everybody has a copy of it and everybody understands not just their role, but understands the policy and procedures and what it means for them. This wasn't part of what I was going to ask you, but I think it's important to ask about reprisal. The convention also covers what to do in case of reprisals, and that reprisals are not acceptable. But we see that happening a lot when folks make complaints. They're treated differently afterwards, or they are left out of certain things. So what can workers do to ensure that there are no reprisals? And if they are experiencing that, what are some tips for them?
Yes, I'll jump in, and then Lavinia, you might want to add to that. And again, I think it's critical to know, and you mentioned this, right? Like, make sure people actually know what the policies and procedures are in their workplace. Hopefully, their policies and procedures have dealt with reprisals, and then what would happen if there is one, right? And who to talk to, and where do you go? But apart from that, like, a reprisal essentially is, your employer starts to treat you differently. You can actually take that outside of your workplace. So if you're in a unionized environment, you're obviously going to want to talk to your union representatives. But if you're in a non-union, you could actually call the Ministry of Labor or the Occupational Health and Safety branch within whichever province you're in to say, this is what's happening. And it could even go so far as to actually have to investigate it and take it to a tribunal board to really make a decision on that. But the key thing is to know that you're not alone. Like, there are supports outside of your employer that you may not know of, and yet that might be the avenue that you need to take to just get some advice. And I don't know if Lavinia would add anything to that.
Yeah, this is, I like this conversation because I think it's really important that people understand their rights as it relates to when something's happening in the workplace. And so, in having that conversation, I think it's also important to know what reprisal is not. So, reprisal is not reasonable management action. Reprisal is not a response, disciplinary action as it relates to the findings of an investigation. Those things would not count as reprisal. But in terms of, reprisal might be that you are protecting your human rights. Say there's some type of a discrimination in the workplace and you are going to speak on behalf of an event. And all of a sudden, because you launched that complaint, you're no longer speaking at that event. Like that would be an example of reprisal. That wouldn't be, arguably, I don't think that would be reasonable management action. So that would fall within the scope of what Leanne was just mentioning as it relates to the definition of reprisal. What can employees do? In terms of avoiding reprisal, I don't think there's much you can do, and I don't mean to sound like a big gray cloud, but there is something that you can do to protect yourself when it happens, because we can't control others, right? Like, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, but how you can protect yourself is by maintaining evidence wherever you can. So documenting things. If you feel that there is decisions that have been made that that do feel reprisal-like in nature, then putting those conversations into emails, kind of veering away from verbal conversations and verbal interactions, because those kind of, they disappear into thin air, and now it's, you said versus they said. So having document all the time, investigations turn on documentation. If you can show me in writing that, this happened and it matches your story, then that's going to be pretty strong evidence because it's corroborated by the documentation that you have. So, I can go on forever on this, but I think the main takeaway piece from everything that I've just said is to protect yourself. You can't avoid it, but you can absolutely protect yourself.
Yeah, the documentation is key. One thing I'd also just, advise people or warn them is don't record anyone, right? Without their knowledge or awareness that they're being recorded. Because I think nowadays, with our smartphones just being so readily available, people think that that's an option for documentation, but that can backfire. So really take good notes. As you said, try to keep things in writing would really be the best approach. The other thing too is that not only is there reprisal, but people need to remember that they have the right to refuse unsafe work, which in most provinces also includes violence. And in some provinces, it includes harassment. So that's another trigger that employees can use to be able to just deal with some of their rights in the workplace.
So as you mentioned, right, I need to say that Convention 190 is a right. It is the first right that has been created in 75 years, and every single person in the world of work has the right to the world of work free from violence and harassment. And so we actually need to be talking about that right a heck of a lot more. It took a long time for folks to understand their other occupational health and safety rights, right to refuse, et cetera. And so we just need to be talking about it a lot so that folks know that anytime you experience violence and harassment, you do have the right to refuse, because it is your right to be in a workspace, world of work that is free from all of that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I'm going to have to go back and look at our own policies and procedures at my company, because I don't think we've identified that right. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Again, it's something that's fairly new, so a lot of folks don't know, which is why I encourage people to actually read the document so that you can see what is there. The document consists of a resolution which has all of these issues, as well as the actual convention and the recommendation, right?
And if I might add, while the convention is new, the Occupational Health and Safety Act is not. And so the convention and the Occupational Health and Safety Act, I would say they're very parallel documents in the sense having pretty much the same safeties, the same rules, regulations, laws. It's pretty much the exact same conversation. But one is just, of course, very new, and the other one has been here, at least in Ontario. I can speak to Ontario. That is where we're based. It's been here. So yeah, I think that's a very important piece of legislation for all employers to make sure they are following. There are very real consequences to breaching the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So it's very important to definitely, apprise yourself of that.
Thanks, Lavinia. And I'll go back to that towards after I ask this next question. So this next question is for Leanne. We know that when a worker is injured on the job, they're eligible for workers' compensation. Since violence and harassment also cause injury, is there coverage for workers that are affected by violence and harassment?
Yeah, so I'm going to give a really good lawyer-like answer. It depends. And really what that is that violence is a little bit more clear-cut. Like if there's a violent incident, you are harmed, it's a bit more clear-cut that you're going to get some sort of workers' compensation coverage. The harassment, that's a little bit trickier and sometimes a little bit harder to be able to really sort of quote unquote prove that it was, caused you harm. But there is the potential, right? And often that falls into stress. Like you can say that I was stressed because of this. There is a doctor that would validate that I have some sort of mental health condition now because of the situation at work. And then that's a little bit more likely that you'll get the workers' compensation coverage. So, it depends. Most important thing though is to report it, right? So a lot of the times employees don't know that they should be reporting these types of incidents, but also reporting it to the board. So there is an employees report in most provinces that you can complete. Also talk to your physician, or a doctor to say, this is what happened to me at work. And also say, are you going to report this to a workers' comp? Because again, employers have what they call the employer's physician's report, right? And they would be reporting that to the board, which could also trigger the possibility of the workers' compensation coverage. So
and when you're talking about the board, so that our listeners understand, it's the Labor Relations Board.
The Workers' Compensation Board.
Workers' Compensation Board. Yeah. And so it's both actually. They should be reporting to the Workers' Compensation Board. And if it's something that is even bigger than that, the Labor Relations Board.
Yeah.
Lavinia, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think Leanne covered it quite robustly. So no, I don't have anything to add to that, surprisingly.
So we talked earlier about the issue of confidentiality and when you file complaints, reprisals, etc. So the issue of confidentiality is of great importance when workers file complaints. How can employers balance the need for confidentiality when investigating violence and harassment, especially when these investigations must be thorough?
Yeah, so I would absolutely, say that you need to make sure that things are as generic and as anonymous as possible. So making sure that we're not using people's real names, or not using their full names, rather, I shouldn't say real names, their full names. Where you can say the respondent or the complainant, then please use that language as opposed to writing out people's full names. Having people agree to confidentiality acknowledgement is also helpful, because I do find that conversation really instills just how important it is to maintain the privacy and the confidentiality of the process. In addition to that, making sure that, you're not tipping off any of the parties to who you might be speaking to next. So oftentimes you can ask, like, is there anyone who can, maybe they witnessed it or they can speak to it, but making it clear that not because they put a name forward means that you are actually going to have that conversation with that person or engage them in the investigation. I do have to go back to that point that I made earlier to reinforce that I do think that separation is important as it relates to employers making sure that they are not conducting the investigation directly, but they're doing it with an external investigator. I find findings, the whole process is much more secure in that way. I mean, people are always going to talk, unfortunately, and breach those confidentiality acknowledgements that we spoke about earlier. But insofar as it relates to unintended or accidental disclosure of the sensitive information, I find that an external investigator has a little bit more control over that as opposed to conducting these things within the workplace. Another suggestion rather that I would make is to not have these conversations on the work site. Something that's very helpful, a present, so to speak, from COVID would be this virtual environment that we're now enjoying. I find it's golden, absolutely golden for maintaining the privacy of conversations. I can be here, the complainant or the parties on the other side of the camera. They're in a secure environment. No one needs to hear. No one needs to see me. No one needs to, see that interaction and kind of put two and two together. Because of course, people are always receiving information from their five senses, right? So there's that as well too. But those are just some of the quick pieces that I would say can really support the confidentiality of an investigation.
Thank you. Leanne, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just add that, again, policies and procedures. So that should be in there, right? Like how they're going to deal with the confidentiality of the information. So that's a good place to just see what kind of, maybe controls the employers put in place for that. And then for those that are business owners or employers, is really you got to lock down the information, right? And keep it really, really confidential and private so that it's not easily accessible by people who shouldn't get access to it. The other thing on the violent situation is oftentimes you have to somehow report the violent incident to the Joint Health and Safety Committee. So again, you're just going to want to try to be as generic as possible in those types of situations. But the likelihood is that people are going to know, right, a violent incident that occurred in the workplace, and that's just unavoidable. But at the same time, we can do our best to just still keep it generic when we're discussing it in any type of forum.
Thank you.
One last thing that I would add to is like all the documents, the evidence, the statements that you're taking, like making sure that you have a secured portal online somewhere or like within a cloud or something that no one can have access to with like double, triple, quadruple if you can, secured checks and balances to make sure that that information doesn't float somewhere. I would really recommend against having paper copies. I think that can fall into the wrong hands, unfortunately, really easily. But luckily for us, I think those secured portals are really beneficial in these types of things.
Thank you. So oftentimes, when these complaints are investigated and there is what's the word I'm looking for? A decision made on how to deal with the investigation. Oftentimes, workers are asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. I just want to hear your thoughts on these agreements. I can give you my thoughts on it. I think when employers insist on non-disclosure agreements, it actually allows the bad behavior to continue. So what are your thoughts on it and how to get around non-disclosure agreements so that the issue, particularly if it's a issue that is repeated in a particular organization, so that that issue is actually dealt with? Anybody can jump in.
Yeah, okay. So I'll tell you, I have little experience with us requiring employees to fill out non-disclosure agreements.
Employers.
For employers to do that. So
sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why I don't have much comment. But what I would say is, I do know, like we often will sign confidentiality agreements right up front when we are employed, right? And I wonder if that kind of covers them, and like in my world anyway, that as an out for that as well, because we've signed it once we've joined the organization. So possibly, I don't know if Lavinia's got anything to add.
Sorry, I was going to say it's employees signing, employers are asking them to sign, it's not usually their investigator or their lawyer, whoever is representing, it's usually the employers.
Right. Yeah, no, we don't do that in our organization. So that's why I don't have much experience there.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Leanne, I would agree with you. I don't really have a lot of experience with the non-disclosure agreements either. I did work for a good amount of time with a very large school board, and we didn't really deal with that there either. I of course have dealt with confidentiality acknowledgements, and the closest thing I could think that might be like a non-disclosure agreement might be like minutes of settlement, whereby like you've kind of avoided the litigation process. You're not going to a trial or anything like that, but you did come to some type of a mediation agreement. And that might be sealed between the parties. But as it relates to an actual NDA, no, I don't have any experience with that. I haven't really seen that, unfortunately. Okay. Yeah.
And the last question that I have for the both of you, given the fact that we are having issues with our Canadian human rights and Ontario human rights tribunals in terms of, how they deal with issues of racism, which is a form of violence and harassment. What are your thoughts on what is happening and what workers can do if they don't feel safe or feel comfortable going to either the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal or the provincial tribunal, as we see that the UN is about to investigate Canada for all of their missteps. I'm being kind. Their missteps when it comes to human rights.
Yeah, I know there are quite a few issues. So just to make sure I'm responding to the right ones, like which one specifically are you referring to?
So the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Canadian Human Rights Commission have found to be racist themselves. In treating the way in which they treat their staff, and also the way in which they agree to take on particular complaints, specifically complaints about racism. Again, it makes the worker, the employee, feel unsafe and untrusting of the systems that are supposed to be there to help them.
Yeah, as it relates to that particular issue, I think it highlights the fact that anti-Black racism is always an underlying current, right? It's the question is how much is anti-Black racism actually contributing to whatever is going on within the workplace? I think it's a positive development as it relates to international human rights that Canada is being held accountable for how our human rights oversight bodies and our decision-making tribunals, how they're dealing with, anti-Black racism, discrimination within their own walls. And so I think it's a positive development that we need to practice what we preach, right? The reason why I said that there are multiple issues within the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal process, in terms of even timelines, right here in Ontario. My last time I checked, if you put in an application and you're hoping for your matter to be dealt with, I think the delays are somewhere between 1, 2 years, 3 years, and it was delayed pre-COVID, but post-COVID it's even more delayed. And so that in and of itself is an obstruction to justice, right? I mean, as it relates to, again, returning back to that procedural fairness and ensuring that we're not making decisions before processes have a chance to, start and continue and end, I guess the investigation process needs to be what it is, and at this point, it's just an allegation. We don't know. I mean, those who have Black skin, I know that I've been in environments where it should be inclusive and it should be equitable, but it absolutely is not. And so, yeah, I'm just interested to see what the end of that might be. But yeah, I think there's a lot of work for Canada to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that is that, thankfully, what a lot of people have known and felt has now come to light, right? And so I think that both Canada, Ontario, and I'm sure there are other provinces, it's not just Ontario. And I hope that they will do the work necessary to rebuild trust, because trust has been broken. right? So let's see where this goes, and I'm hopeful, I'm always an optimist, that this will lead to more improvement and a little bit more trust in the systems that are supposed to be there to protect us.
Yeah, that is my hope as well. Lavinia.
Yeah, and I also think it's actually quite disgraceful that this is happening within like the International Decade for Peoples of African Descent, which
Thank
was
you.
extended, right? It was extended because the situation is so dire that 10 years wasn't enough to properly probe the issues and, of course, respond and act accordingly. And so, it's shameful because Canada has a very long history, and currently continues. I guess we're getting better as it relates to identifying that yes, anti-Black racism exists, that it is a two-tier citizenship for those who are Black, and that it's real. Like we, as Canadians, Canadian society has a tendency to, point across the border and say that's an American issue. We don't have those issues, but it's alive and well here. Like we don't have as many Black people, as many racialized individuals living within our borders as, the population is within the United States. But that doesn't mean that the problem is any less awful for those who do occupy Black or brown skin. So there's a lot of work to be done. It doesn't surprise me. It's not shocking at all that that's happening there. I think it's actually very much in alignment with, historically how Canada has dealt with Black people. So we'll
Yeah.
see it. Yeah.
I mean, the country, Canada, took 3 years after the decade started to announce the decade. So yes, in Canada, it's been extended 3 years, and the hope is that internationally it will also be extended. So Convention 190, because it's been ratified by Canada, individuals, organizations can also hold Canada accountable through the UN process as well. You can file complaints through the UN process. So again, I'm encouraging folks. I know that the Black class action lawsuit and the Indigenous class action lawsuit have both tried to take some steps to do that. Whether they're successful or not, we don't know. I also want to encourage folks, ensure that the convention, you read the convention, that it's part of your collective agreement, part of your policies and procedures of the organization. It's very, very easy to read and understand, and it can be found very, very easily on the internet. I had several copies and I've given away all the, I think 30 or 50 copies that I had. The convention lays out what needs to be done, and the recommendation 206 provides the guidance in terms of how it can be used to prevent and protect you against violence and harassment. It also has guidance in terms of how to enforce it, what remedies and assistance are available to workers and employers, as well as what training and who is responsible to provide this particular training. So I encourage everyone to read it. I also know that there are toolkits on the internet to help facilitators, to help employers, and help workers understand Convention 190 and how it relates to you and how best to use it in your own circumstance. The stuff that Leanne put on from the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety is also very, very helpful. And I encourage folks to read it, take a look at it, use it, utilize. If you know people that are on that, again, one of the few tripartite organizations that deals with health and safety in Canada, I encourage folks to take a look at that. So, it is my hope that every single country will ratify this convention. It's already made great strides. I think we have 45 ratifications, and it's only been in force for a few years. So, it's my hope that in my lifetime, I will see more ratifications and that the majority of member states will ratify so that we do see the eradication of violence and harassment in the world of work. I want to take this opportunity to first of all, to ask both of our panelists if they have any other parting words.
I actually wanted to ask you, what was your biggest takeaway or, memories from being a part of this work?
For me, it was being able to share the stories of workers. As the Executive Vice President and Secretary Treasurer of the Canadian Labour Congress for 19 years, I heard stories that I couldn't tell anyone because people ask for, confidentiality, as you know, is often the case. but to be able to share those stories and hear the stories globally that were similar to what people were saying here. Most of the time it was Black women, racialized women, and to be able to get our experiences validated globally, I think was a huge takeaway. And the fact that this convention will help workers who are in the informal economy. I have never seen a group of workers so ecstatic for an adoption of a convention. They ran around the room dancing, singing, just hugging, crying. It was a the whole thing. It was a negotiation that took 2 years. And the 2 years was very, very emotional. For me, I got to talk about my own experiences as a leader in the trade union movement. It was not nice. It was not pretty. And I think at the end of the first year, I totally broke down. I shared my experience. We had a situation where the Africa group of governments walked out of the convention, walked out on the negotiations because people just couldn't understand that they were still dealing with colonialism and all of the stuff that they had held in. And so, yeah, my biggest takeaway was knowing that I was not alone, and that the people out there who had been dealing with violence and harassment on a global scale were not alone, and that this convention won't just help you file a complaint or deal with a complaint. This convention will actually save lives. So thank you so much for that, Leanne. A huge thank you to our panelists, Leanne and Lavinia, for a thoughtful, insightful, and very passionate conversation. I want to thank the technical team, Takea and Donna, who are behind the scenes, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. And thanks to all of you who joined us today for this very necessary conversation. It is my hope that violence and harassment will be eradicated. And I hope to see all of you September 28th as we induct another 100 accomplished Black women into the sisterhood. Yes, Lavinia, before we leave.
Yeah, the one last takeaway point that I wanted to share was just like following up with thank you so much for this amazing panel and esteemed members of the 100 ABC honorees. One of the things I wanted to empower those who are watching to follow your passion as it relates to how you feel about the issues. So I didn't just remain a lawyer and not jump into investigations because it wasn't something that I was passionate about. Similar to what you said, Marie, as it related to people running investigations and seeing findings that just weren't fair. I remember reading those and being like, you know what, like, I don't want to be forced to follow this awful finding. I want to be a part of that. And so empowering the audience that's here today, you don't have to be a lawyer to be an investigator. You absolutely can become a workplace investigator by getting involved in one of the courses. There's an HRPA workplace investigator course. There's also an Osgood advanced PD. If you're an HR executive, you can do that as well. So the reason I share that is we need more people with lived experiences who understand those who are launching their complaints and where they're coming from when they can't put their finger on why it feels like racism, but it is. We need people who, you know, they felt it so they know it, and they're on the other side of writing those investigation reports and able to see the issues from a more linear, holistic rather, lens. So I'll just leave it at that, but thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize. I did skip over you. Apologies. But yes, you are 100% correct. And I think that being the main negotiator, because I had experienced it, it was much easier to negotiate. I knew exactly what we wanted in this convention. The scope of this convention is still not evident to everyone. Again, I encourage people to read it, read between the lines. Everything that is in there applies to all of us, and we can definitely use it to ensure that not just our employers and organizations treat people in a dignified and respectful way, but the country, the province, the city also does the same thing. Again, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And again, I hope to see everyone on the 28th of September. Thank you. Please enjoy the rest of your amazing Canada Day weekend.
Look how far you have come on your own, but never alone.